2001 or so. And my first taste of open source was PHP Nuke, which then made me basically decide that my cat could probably write a better CMS than that. So I did custom CMSs for a long time. And then when I found Drupal, I was like, oh yeah, internationalization, right. And security, that's probably a good thing too. So it was really cool to find this community that built this thing that was basically everything PHP Nuke wasn't, you know, so that was great. So what are we talking about today? I'm going to do a really brief intro of Drupal, mostly just to context set a little bit, but also if anybody wants to come to the hackathon tonight, you know, you'll know everything there is to know about Drupal. Just kidding. We'll talk a little bit about then versus now, kind of what the code looks like and used to look like. We'll talk about, you know, how to actually go about a mammoth undertaking like this, and some of the lessons that we've learned in the process. So once upon a time, in a dorm room far away, this is Dries' dorm room, which includes things, you know, like his chessboard. You know, he has a stamp collection. He's a big, huge nerd. Oh, I even have these labeled. Yeah, that's right. Yep. A domain name was mistyped. Dries meant to measure dorp.org, which is Dutch for village, but instead registered drop.org. And a project called Drupal was born. And it's called Drupal because Drupal is like the anglicization of the word drop in Dutch. So what is Drupal? Drupal is basically a content management system that you can kind of get 80% of your site done. You turn on modules that are like features. You can build out your content model and entities and fields. So if you were building an event website, you might have an event, you know, type with fields like, you know, date, and you know, you could have a sponsor list that's an entity reference and things like this. You create custom listings of that content, so you can create sidebar blocks, administration tables, gallery views, maps, stuff like that. And then you make it pretty by slapping a theme on it. But the biggest thing that Drupal offers is you do all of that with 0 lines of code. So what we do as Drupal developers is we basically empower people who could never write a line of code to save themselves to actually be able to do really sophisticated, powerful websites just by themselves without having to call on us. And then we work on the really interesting problems like how do you create a dynamic entity field system that has a UI exposed and da-da-da-da-da. So it's a really challenging thing to develop for. We also then layer that on top of a content management framework, which is for that last 20%. And so this is where you want to extend Drupal to do a different thing, or you want to integrate with a third-party system or a legacy system. And then finally, we have this awesome community. So we've got about 1.1 million users that we know about. 35,000 of those are developers. And within our core contributions, we have 2,400. So it's a really, really big community, and it's a lot of fun. But because Drupal does, you know, 80% through pointy-clicky, a lot of those people are actually people who were non-technical and learned PHP via Drupal. So we have a lot of these people that are hobbyists, or they were self-taught, or these kinds of things. So, you know, that was a really big deal. You know, oh, and we power 2% of the web, including this little startup in DC you might have heard of, like White House. But anyway, so welcome to the Isle of Drupal. It was founded in 2001. These were other things that happened in 2001. That's the very first iPod. That's the Game Boy Advance. And Windows XP. Where would we be without Windows XP? Probably a lot happier web developers. But anyway. Back then, you know, it was like PHP 4.0, and 00 support existed, but it wasn't great. And so we basically had to invent some creative ways to extend Drupal without the use of object-oriented programming. And a lot of those, you know, sort of workarounds exist today. So just briefly, one of them is called hooks. The way this works is you're in some module and you want to fire off an event. So you call this, you know, module invoke function, and then basically in an individual module, if they name their function module name underscore hook name, it will fire when that hook is, you know, done. So it's very similar to like an event system in Symfony or anything else, but the way it's done is with function naming conventions, which is very easily approachable and hackable for a non-programmer. But, you know, we run into problems with like naming spacing conventions, and, you know, if there's actually a address module, then if you have an address, whatever, it just like, you can have conflicts and stuff. It's basically, you know, built on people following the rules, not by any kind of enforced convention. We also have what I call magically named mystery meat functions. So these are not hooks, but if you have a function named example form, you can name it function example form validate or example form submit, and that will actually do validate and submit logic. So again, naming convention based. It's very easy to extend it, but you have to know about these things, either by copying and pasting from another example or whatever, because there's no interface that's going to tell you this is what the form API looks like. Then we have this build alter pattern. We love our arrays, especially arrays of arrays of arrays of arrays. Those are the best. And so we have a function that builds out an array and then pass in that array to another function, an alter function, which can then make modifications to that. And it's a really powerful pattern because when you have things like menus or forms or things like that that are this structure, you can do basically whatever you want, inject custom logic or change the permission access in this case that is needed, all kinds of things. It's very flexible, but everything that you learn is, Drupal specific. We also have a huge mistrust of third-party code traditionally. Does anybody remember this vulnerability? It was in 2005. The XML RPC library that shipped with all of these projects was found to be, have some kind of a gaping hole. And that was a little traumatizing because that list just keeps going and going and going. When that happened, we sort of decided, whoa, let's pull back, let's write our own stuff, let's make sure that we check it and we know it's secure, and sort of caused a huge, kerfuffle. But some of the pain points we have with Drupal are, it requires a lot of unlearning when you are, more traditionally programmer, based, and then you get into this thing with like function naming conventions. That's not how you do extension in any other language. Normally you have objects, you have inheritance, you have, things like this. The array APIs are undocumentable. You can document them, but there's nothing in your IDE that will tell you about them. There's a lot of what we call Drupalism, stuff that only Drupal does and other things don't. So when you become a topic expert in Drupal 7, that knowledge is not broadly applicable to other frameworks. There's also a huge culture of not invented here. We're really trying to break away from that. But for example, our issue tracker, our continuous integration environment, and our packaging system are all Drupal based. Because you can do that with Drupal, but you probably shouldn't. But anyway, we also have a talent pool issue because, again, it's really hard to pull people from external projects into our project because of the unlearning aspect. But once you get in, it's wonderful, and you can do anything you want. I use Drupal because I'm a fundamentally lazy person, and I want to learn one thing that I can use for any type of web thing I'll have to build, and it's great for that. So enter Drupal 8. And here we are, we're rejoining the rest of the PHP world. So if you look at the source code of Drupal 8, you'll find things like Composer is in there. We're using Symfony services. We've split our code into objects and specifically into components. And we've sort of split them up into, one part of components are ones that we think would be broadly useful to other people's. There's some utility classes and things like that in there. And then anything that's our own component, we put in the core folder. We use the PSR4 auto-loading structure for our classes. All of the code that used to be in one gigantic file is now split up into multiple class files. We're using Twig as the presentation layer, and there's a lot of YAML everywhere. We used to have our own specific INI-ish syntax, and we now have sort of, moved on from that. We also have fostered this amazing culture of proudly invented elsewhere. So we're pulling in components like Symfony, PHP Unit, Composer, Twig, Guzzle, all of these different things because we looked at stuff and said, we don't have to build all of this ourselves. We can actually look at people who've done a great job building this and just pull in what they've done. So Hello World in Drupal 8 looks like this. You have an info YAML file, which just registers some metadata. And you have an example routing file, which uses the Symfony routing component. You set up your path. You give it a place to go for the class, and then you give it a permission to access. And then in your example controller, we use namespaces. We also use like PHP traits, some of the modern languages or modern features of PHP. You extend from a controller base class, and then you just create a method in there that returns something. A lot of controllers return this because we had to give ourselves something to do in Drupal 9. But you can also just return a Symfony response object or anything else that you like. So how did we get here? That's quite a big delta. When you look at the code that Drupal 7 looks like, and then you look at the code that Drupal 8 looks like, it's massively, massively different. So there are two sides to any migration. Obviously, there's the code, right? The code has to be migrated. There's also the people, though. And you ignore this side at your great, great peril. Because if you have people who are invested in your project, you want to make sure they come along with you when you're doing some sort of a massive upgrade like this. So the first thing you want to do is you want to set the stage. So you should have some basic prerequisites in place before you endeavor on something like this. So one is get your user base onto a modern platform. So something that actually Larry Garfield had led an initiative on way back in 2007, I think, was, PHP 4 was still hanging around and PHP 5 was out there, but hosting companies were not widely adopting it. So he started basically a coalition of different open source projects and hosting companies to say, we're vowing that the next version of our software is not going to run on PHP 4. It's going to require PHP 5.2 or greater. And so that was really, really fundamentally important, because if we were still dragging the boat anchor of PHP 4 around, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. You want to add metric buttloads, that's a Canadian term, of automated test coverage. So you want to make sure that you have, and it's fine if they're integration tests, they don't have to be unit tests, any kind of test coverage just to let you know that what you're doing is still working. Because we actually managed to get all of this refactoring done in Drupal 8 without breaking the test suite once. And the way we were able to do that is because our continuous integration environment, informs us every time we upload a patch whether or not it passes or fails. You also want to introduce a taste of the future. So if you try and do this all at once, people are going to freak out. They'll still freak out either way, but it will go a lot easier if you, in Drupal 7, what we did is we migrated the database abstraction layer to object-oriented programming. So basically, people were sort of familiar with this and already had used it in their modules a little bit. So it wasn't like completely dousing them. And we also already started using some external libraries like jQuery. All of us universally agreed as PHP programmers, we don't want to have to maintain JavaScript. So that was really easy to sort of make that case. And so it was about taking those lessons learned, how we did this in Drupal 7 and it didn't turn out too badly, and then applying them to the future. Then the second thing, I'm counting in PHP array style here. The second thing you want to do is set ambitious goals, because there's going to be a lot of pain before the payoff, and you want to make sure that that payoff is really worth it. So in Drupal 8, what we decided to do what Dries decided to do was establish these initiatives. And so these were, sort of things that were either pain points we knew about in Drupal or things that would get the users really, really excited if they were fixed. And so, he, appointed leaders, and the leaders built teams around each of these initiatives to try and, give some direction to the way Drupal 8 was going to shape up. And then what you do is you refactor as a part of achieving those goals. Because refactoring on its own is not going to be compelling for anybody, but if you tell people, like, this is the carrot you get at the end of this stick, that makes it a lot more palatable to folks. And it also motivates your volunteers. And I would say, looking back, that the initiatives who had the most success in Drupal 8 were people who communicated early and often. That's really, really important. And they documented their decision making. Because what you don't want to do is get into a situation where you're explaining for the 4,500th time of why we are doing this and we're not doing this. They also built a team around them, and they really went out of their way to genuinely value that team. And they sought ways to scale themselves as well. So they didn't try and do the whole thing by themselves. What they tried to do is they acknowledged the fact that this is a huge undertaking. It's only going to get done if I can build people around me who are willing to do that work. So they delegated stuff. They did things like create a presentation that could then be held in any Drupal camp around the world. And they sort of sought ways like that to onboard people. The other thing to realize is that if you're doing major change, you're going to need major buy-in around that change. So that starts with getting the right people in the right room. So here's an example. We did a web services sprint when we were trying to make the decision of whether or not we would move to Symfony. So we invited, Dries and, Fabienne Potencier, maybe, the Symfony project lead, initiative leads for Drupal, some community voices who could help, sort of like monitor the community angst around the decision and could help people through it, and also detractors to the decision. And you might say, like, why would you invite detractors? Aren't those the people you want out of the room so they don't derail everything? Not really, because honestly, when you think about a detractor, there are pure trolls out there, that just like messing with you for fun and games, but most of the time a troll is just someone who's feeling really frustrated and unheard. And so if you invite them into the circle and you allow them a venue for expressing their frustrations, that's great. Then they feel like they are actually listened to. It totally tempers down their temper, and that you can actually have a conversation. And you never know, they might actually be right. Like maybe they're so pissed off because their concerns are valid. It allows you to build trust and remove defensiveness, and if you manage to do this right, you can actually turn your biggest detractor into your biggest advocate as long as they feel ownership in the decision-making process. You also really, really need to show your work, because you cannot come out of a sprint like this and say, we're doing this, and then everyone go, oh, okay, that sounds great. No. People have to trust your decision-making process and understand how you achieve that. So you need a lot of transparency, not just on the final decision-making, but the process that led up to that, And also move it to the issue queue or whatever works for your project where people collaborate on development, because if you don't do that, it never happened, and you want everyone to be able to, have feedback on the decision. And then you get to the point where you have to actually get her done. And so I'm going to shamelessly rip off Larry Garfield's great presentation on eating elephants. So you should go check that out, but this is basically the gist of what he said. So how do you eat a huge PHP elephant like this, an enormous undertaking? How do you do that? Well, you do it one bite at a time. And you do it one bite at a time with friends and lots of friends, right? So, a lot of what we did in Drupal 8 was take this mammoth undertaking and break it out into much smaller tasks so that each individual one could be taken by one developer, and then we would use our events to sort of bring 400 people on board and say, here, you convert this controller, or this menu callback to a controller. You do this, you do this, you do this. And over time, we saw things actually start to happen. For new functionality, writing code should not be the first response. Finding if shared code exists should be the first response. This is a quote from Beth Tucker-Long, who I believe is here. And that's, it's sort of like, instead of thinking we have to rewrite all of this stuff ourselves, just, periscope up a little bit. It's very common to fall into your silo of your project that you're working on. Go take a look at what's around. There's a lot of projects these days that are not only doing great things, but also building their code in a way that can be easily shared among projects. So don't waste time building something that someone's already done. And if someone's really passionate about maintaining, a methodology to go out and ping web services and stuff like that, great. Pull from what they've done. Don't try and do that yourself. For existing functionality, you want to refactor your app and not replace it. And when you have a component that does a specific thing, like for example, cryptography especially, don't refactor it, just simply move it to the new paradigm. You don't want to get into a situation where you've both, moved something to object-oriented code and then also broken the cryptography on it. That's not a good situation. When you build new code, do it as components. Just like in PHP world, we try and do components and then share it with yourself, because that means that it can then be shared with other people. However, if it's not broken, don't try and fix it. Take this one step at a time. So one of the things that we've done in Drupal 7 or Drupal 8 in this process is, if we have Drupal 7 code that looks like this, what we would often do is leave like a backwards compatibility shim in there to ease the porting process. So, here's 3 functions that go and get, and set stuff from cache. So what we would do is mark those things deprecated, and then we would have them calling out to the object-oriented way to do it. And for a while there, we used like a global service locator that still exists for procedural code, but now it's all nicely dependency injected and all that. But this allowed you to convert the new stuff to the new way inside these procedural functions, but then leave the old way still as a backwards compatibility. And then over time, you can sort of convert those things out. And those made great tasks for some of the 2,400 people out there that were contributing to core. It's like, oh, this is a really simple find replace thing that you can help us with. And the biggest thing to remember is that incremental progress is still progress. So this stuff isn't going to happen overnight. And if it does, you would kill yourself. So do it over time, have the goal in mind, and then get everybody on board to help you out. The other thing to do is recognize that this major change is going to be really, really scary. And the biggest tool that you have in your chain for that is empathy, because people don't respond well to saying, well, you're just afraid of change. They don't want to hear that, because maybe they are afraid of change, but they probably have a valid reason. Some of the reasons in our community are fear of losing investment in the platform, particularly if it was your code being replaced. This is a graph that shows the learning curves of common CMSs. So you see like ModX, WordPress and Joomla down there, and then this thing that's like a cliff with like people hanging themselves and a bulldozer like shoveling bodies over the side. That would be Drupal's learning curve. So people have climbed the cliff, and they've avoided being dumped over the side with a bulldozer. They don't want to have to go up that cliff again, especially when they're at the top of their game, and they're billing top dollar for clients. They really, really don't want to lose that position that they've worked really, really hard to build themselves over time. They're also really afraid of going back to square one and being unable to catch up. And this is particularly pertinent if you have an aging community, because if you have kids and a mortgage to pay and all this kind of stuff, you can't go and like take every weekend off or stay up until 2 in the morning, as Luke said yesterday, every single night, trying to learn this new thing. It's just not going to work. And so there's a lot of fear about that aspect, like how am I ever possibly going to learn all of this stuff? And it's not even just the object-oriented stuff, it's also the tool chain, right? A lot of people just get by and, Notepad and grep or whatever, If you are used to that, you really, in object-oriented land, really, really, really need an IDE, or you need something that helps you with that. And so it's not just the object-oriented concepts that are going to be new to you, but also everything that you use as a developer is going to change. And the biggest thing that struck our community is that, the fear of losing what makes your community you. Going back to the earlier slide, we have a lot of non-technical people who became technical people via Drupal. Will those people be able to make the jump? That was a huge concern for us. So some of the things that we've done to try and mitigate these concerns is a lot of connecting, a lot of hearing people out, talking it out, trying to understand where they're coming from, inviting people to sprints and planning meetings, stuff like that, so they can kind of understand it's not quite as scary as you think it is. A lot of documentation, pointing people off to great resources elsewhere on the internet that explain this stuff, detailed API docs, books, stuff like that. Do a lot of training, At our events at DrupalCons, we have about 3,500 people or so that go to DrupalCon. And on the sprint day, on the last day, we always split the day in half. So the first half of the day is just newbie contributor training. So we teach them what is Git and how do you get a development environment set up, and what is your issue, what is the issue queue and how does it work and stuff like that. And then we pair them up with a mentor who finds a particular issue that they would be great to work with and then works with them over the day to get it done. And at the end of the day, someone like me goes and on stage and commits their patch live in front of everybody, and yay, it's like a big community building thing, but it's a lot of fun. And it makes it fun, it makes it less scary for people. We have a lot of tools, inspectors, scaffolding. One of the projects I'm working on at work right now is it's called Drupal Module Upgrade. It actually ports your code from 7 to 8 automatically. It uses this awesome library called Farberus, which essentially parses PHP into a jQuery-like tree. It's crazy awesome. So tools like that to kind of help keep people get their foot in the door. We also focus a lot on what we call developer experience, so eliminating a lot of boilerplate code whenever we could, providing consistency and learnability of patterns. So although Drupal 8 is overwhelming at first, it's really you learn 2 things, and then that just applies across the whole system. It's you make a class, you tell Drupal about it. That's basically all you do. And then you reinforce along the way that these OO practices are literally used everywhere. I went to a few different sessions yesterday, and it was session after session, that looks like Drupal 8. But the benefit is you get to learn on a platform you already know. So if you're moving from an object or from a procedural base to an object-oriented base, the fundamental concepts of your framework are not changing. They're just changing syntax and trying to reinforce people that all that stuff that you worked really hard to learn, that still applies even when you use arrow thingies instead of brackety thingies. And then when stuff hits the fan, so I don't know how many people know this, but about a year ago, this whole business reached sort of a fever pitch, and we ended up having a fork of Drupal called Backdrop. And this was a really, really traumatizing thing at the time. A lot of people were very, very concerned. And a lot of the things that drove Backdrop to happen were these fears that we're talking about. And the lack of adequate response to addressing those fears. So I guess I have a couple pieces of advice if this ever happens to you. I would say you should definitely resist. Your initial reaction is going to be very emotional and very hurt and angry and things like this. Don't react, listen. Listen to what the people who forked are saying, listen to what people are saying about that situation. And what we found is that, Backdrop really stirred up a lot of long long-standing feelings about that people weren't happy about the direction of Drupal or the type of leadership that was happening in Drupal, and it was very useful to get that feedback. At the same time, we also found that the developers working on Drupal 8 found that incredibly demoralizing because, Backdrop at the time was trying to raise, I don't know what it was, like $10,000 or something. And in the meantime, these guys are sitting here every night, sacrificing nights, weekends, time with family, all this kind of stuff to get Drupal 8 done. And, they're seeing the numbers go up in their little, Indiegogo campaign. It was just like, what? So it was really important to understand the emotions involved and try and parse that out. There's going to be FUD, but you can dispel the FUD while taking the high road at the same time. You want to help those existing devs who are going to be hurt by this accentuate the positives. So what we did when we saw, some of these people just, some of the Drupal 8 developers just feeling totally like crushed, is we said, you know what, go on your blog and talk about what you're really excited about. Like, you're working on all this stuff every night. Why do you do that? What is cool about that? And so what we saw is like the community really galvanizing around this, yeah, Drupal 8 is awesome. I should tell more people about it. And it was sort of a counter message to everything that was happening, and it was really the core development team banding together and feeling like, no, we can do this, and we're part of this family, and let's tell other people about it. I would also advise to try and maintain the relationship with the forkers. A cordial relationship is great because you still fundamentally come from the same place. It's possible you guys can borrow code from each other. It's even possible someday maybe that they might come back into your project. You never know. So don't eliminate those possibilities by letting the emotions take over. And then if there's concerns that you're seeing resonate with your community, address them. It doesn't matter if they came because of this highly emotional fork. It doesn't matter if they're sort of like resonating in your community. Just take the steps to actually make them happen. So one example where we've done this in Drupal 8 is semantic versioning. So one of Backdrop's criticisms of Drupal is our upgrade path between major versions is essentially 2 middle fingers. Right? It's like we rewrite the whole code base and we'll provide an upgrade path, but you're on your own for porting your code. So what we're going to be doing when Drupal 8 ships is doing feature releases every 6 months, where we preserve backwards compatibility. And this is great for a number of reasons. One, it's going to allow us to iterate faster than once every 3 or 4 years, which is great, right? Like, iterate kind of implies more often than every half decade, so that's great. And then both core devs and users will be working on the same code base, rather than core devs working up here and then user base working down here and then being help, there's problems, and people are like, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about because I'm in wonderland over here. So it's good to like bring everybody into the same fold, and I think we'll get a lot of that'll actually accomplish 2 goals. One, it will mean core developers are solving real-world problems that are hitting people in the field. It'll also mean like kind of growing more empathy in the core dev team for like what people deal with day-to-day in Drupal. And then we will eventually have a Drupal 9, and Drupal 9 will break backwards compatibility, but we're not planning to even touch that until there's enough sort of out there in sandboxes and other places to actually warrant breaking BC. And I would predict that would be years probably after Drupal 8, because I think there's a ton of stuff we can do in Drupal 8 now that we've got this great framework to build on top of that we could do just fine. And the last thing is to avoid some common pitfalls that certainly hurt us and could hurt you as well. So please learn from our mistakes. The perfect is the enemy of the better, or the good enough, or the slightly more awesome than shitty, okay? So please do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Incremental progress is still progress, as I said. Drupal 8 is going to ship in some sort of a hybrid state. There's still going to be procedural stuff. There's still going to be array APIs here and there. But we'll clean that up over time through the Drupal 8 release, and we'll deprecate more APIs and things like that. There's always time to make it better, that kind of stuff. Trying to do the entire code base in one go as an all-you-can-eat buffet, it gives you a tummy ache, We started this process, we opened Drupal 8 for development in 2011. I would say we started this process more like 2013 or 2012. 12, yeah. So we started it about a year after Drupal 7 came out. And we're still working on it. And, it'll ship eventually. It's certainly taking a long time. Don't be afraid to say no. You know, people will try and glom all of their ornaments onto your Christmas tree, and it's okay to say, we'll do that, we'll put that ornament on later or next year or something like that. And when you make big decisions like this, make them early in your process and explicitly. So there should always be a link to point to say, nope, this is what we're doing. And it's okay to, you know, want to question that, or to, you know, there should be a process for people with better ideas. But everybody needs to be on the same page of what you're building. Because if you have a bunch of different silos who aren't talking to each other, that can cause a lot of trouble. So in summary, set the stage, set ambitious goals. If you make major change, you're going to need major buy-in from your community. You should recognize that major change is scary and try and find out where people are coming from and meet them there. And avoid some of the common pitfalls that befall people who try and take on a huge project like this. So we as Drupal are definitely not out of the woods yet. We have about 120 or so critical issues we have to solve before we can ship it. But you know, we're thrilled to once again join the PHP world. And yeah, I really want to thank you for inviting me and for everyone to be here. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Angie. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, there's one right there. Hold on one second. Testing. Don't hold it too close.
So it sounded like a lot of what you talked about as far as buy-in had to do with developers. What did you have to do for the clicky pointy people to bring them along as well?
Oh, that's a great question. It's funny because for the pointy clicky people, there's really nothing at all contentious in Drupal 8. Because if anything, Drupal 8 is the first version of Drupal where the pointy clicky people will be able to do something without downloading other modules to add to Drupal. So views comes in core, WYSIWYG comes in core, some of the data modeling features like NAD reference and date that comes in core. So like you can literally build an actual site with just core for the first time in years. So we really didn't have much of a problem with the site builder audience. Their problem is like, when are you going to ship it so we can use all that cool stuff? It's the developer audience that was the hairy thing, because the pointy clicky people, they don't care what it looks like under the hood. They will care when they hit that barrier at the 80%, and then they need to actually extend the platform. And so we're going to need a lot of really great resources for them. We have a portion of our handbook that's the snippets section, where people can find things to copy and paste. So we're going to need to make sure that those snippets get ported to Drupal 8 so that people can still, who don't have any idea what they're doing will still be able to do it. But ultimately, like I've talked to a few of these sort of people in the site builder audience, kind of concerned about that, how did non-techies make the jump to OOP? And they were basically like, I don't know, I'm going to do what I do right now, which is copy and paste it and start hacking at it until it works, And I think that's true. I think that's how a lot of people learn PHP. That's how I learned PHP way back in the day. So, it's just for people who actually know development stuff, it's a lot more complex because your backtrace is now this long, and there's some stuff like that. So we'll see. But I would say, like, on the whole, the site builder audience, their main concern is like, when does Drupal 8 ship so I can start using it? In my experience.
All right. Thank you very much, Angie.
Thank you.